the challenge is always in writing a book that is really research-based is to knowing when to stop researching and start writing.
Yes.
And I think I've learnt this over the course of writing 3 books, to get writing early, even if you haven't finished all your research. Like, that is just as important in some ways as doing the research. Otherwise, you never get to the writing. And so,
Yes.
what is the point of doing it all? And then the other thing is just drafts, pulling out the unnecessary detail so that those magic details can kind of shine.
Hello, I'm Gabriella Kelly-Davies. Welcome to Season 5 of Biographers in Conversation. In each episode, biographers chat about the multiplicity of choices they face while crafting life stories. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's first storytellers, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal people are the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you today. You'll find us wherever you listen to your podcasts and on our website, biographersinconversation.com. Let's start the show. In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, Cynthia Banham chats with me about her choices while researching and crafting Mother Shadow and meditation on maternal inheritance. A hybrid of biographical reimagining, lyrical memoir and transnational family history, Mother Shadow is poetic, with whimsical detours and meditative qualities. Mother Shadow blends personal reflections on the challenges of mothering with a reconstruction of the life of Cynthia's 19th century Italian ancestor, an unmarried peasant who abandoned her daughter to a foundling home. The narrative is underpinned by meticulous archival research. These sources enabled Cythnia to reconstruct the probable life and circumstances of her ancestor, a woman who left no direct testimony. Cynthia, welcome to Biographers in Conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Please introduce us to Mother Shadow.
So, Mother Shadow took me probably 9 years to write. It begins with the story of my mother's maternal grandmother, who I discovered was a foundling. The book sort of becomes really about mothers who can't, because of personal or social circumstances, mother in the way that they perhaps would like to. And so the book also blends my own experiences of mothering with a disability and my feelings of inadequacy about that.
A single archival revelation ignited your curiosity about your great-grandmother, Natalia. What was this discovery?
Yes, so Nonna, my mother's mother, had 2 sisters, and she was the eldest, and she passed away, middle sister passed away, and the younger sister was moving into an aged care facility, and my mum was helping her move her things. And I said to my mum, if there are any family records, please, can you not throw them away? I don't have much from my nonna's side of the family, and I would just love to see anything that's in there. And nobody else was interested, and so my mum brought a small packet to me of documents, and inside there I very unexpectedly found an old birth record from 1898. It belonged to my nonna's mother, so my great-grandmother, Natalina, who I'd always been told was an orphan from Bologna, and never thought I would discover anything more about her. And so I'd sort of focused in my previous research on my grandfather's family instead. But this birth record, which was torn down one corner, had this word, brefotrofio, which I didn't know what it meant. And my mum, who's fluent in Italian, didn't know what it meant. And I looked it up, and it means a foundling home, a place where abandoned or illegitimate children were taken in the 19th century. And with that word, I realised that Natalina wasn't an orphan, she was a foundling, that her mother had been alive but had given her up.
What's the difference between a foundling home and an orphanage?
In Italian society, I think right up until probably the mid 20th century, much more stigma attached to a child was a foundling than a child who was an orphan. A child who was an orphan, even though they were brought up in an institution, still had attachments to known family members, whereas foundlings didn't. They were completely cut off from their past, and they were completely the sort of property of the state. And so this really distinguished them in the sense of foundlings having no family at all were looked down upon in a way that orphans who still had family who wanted to be associated with them did not.
What transformed your curiosity into a detective-like quest to learn why Natalia was abandoned by her mother?
I guess it was the question which came to me very early on upon reading this document of why did this mother give up her daughter? I reacted very strongly to the discovery in a way that didn't really make sense at the time. I sort of felt like it was an abandonment of all of us, like all of us who came after, that we had somehow been denied this history, this connection to this woman. And I also felt this terrible sorrow for this child, my great grandmother, who'd grown up without the love of her mother. So I became quite obsessed with finding out who the mother was so that I could possibly discover why she would have given up her child. At the same time, a little bit curious about why my reaction was so strong, because once I started researching foundlings in 19th century Italy, I realized very quickly, as I should have, that it was social circumstances, it was pressures from the church and society that shamed unwed mothers into relinquishing their children that, in all likelihood, compelled Natalina's mother to give her up. And so why did I react in the way that I reacted, and what could I learn about this mother's personal circumstances that had led to this happening? That became sort of my fixation and my obsession. And yeah, it did become this sort of detective-like quest to get to the bottom of it as much as I could.
It's extraordinary, really, when you think about how far back in history it is and the reaction that you had to that. I think it's extraordinary. I'm curious about the book's title, especially a meditation in the subtitle. Why did you choose it?
Mother Shadow, to start with, that was the title that I came up with first, and it wasn't the first title. I came up with some titles that I'm glad I didn't use. I wanted the idea of the mother to be there, and I wanted to juxtapose it with an idea of a feeling about that. And so I think I had like rows of just sort of columns of words that I just kept putting together, and until I found the right combination of mother and shadow. So it was, yeah, the mother was obviously central to the story, and then kind of that feeling that I associate with the idea of the mother as casting a shadow over everything you do, who you become, your life. So that's how I sort of came up with that. The second subtitle, A Meditation on Maternal Inheritance, was really to sort of broaden it and to encompass some of the ideas that I explored about mothering and motherhood, as well as my own family's history more generally.
It's interesting how once you settle on a title, you just know in your bones that that's the right title.
So this title, once I found it, it definitely felt like it was meant to be. My previous book, which also blended memoir and family history, it was really difficult to find a title, and I don't have the same feelings about that title, that it was, meant to be. So I think it was a bit of luck with this book, and also I approached it in a different way, like that brainstorming with the columns and my ideas. I didn't do that the last time, and so perhaps I learnt something from that process about titles that I hadn't before. It's all a learning exercise.
We never just do it in isolation. Our subconscious is always working on it and our book and our research, and eventually it comes up with the right. And that's why it feels so right, I think, because it's an unconscious thing.
It's comforting to think that our subconscious is doing that work for us, even if it may not seem so clear to us in the here and now. Yeah.
You open Mother Shadow with a chapter titled Judgment. In it, you describe your reaction to discovering that Natalia's mother placed her into a foundling home and did not consent to be named. I'd love you to read a few passages from this chapter.
Of course. I read down to the end of the first page until one of the last lines pulled me up. Those jarring words, che non consente di essere nominata, who does not consent to be named. They were her mother's words, and I hadn't been expecting them. Natalina, this told me, was not an orphan at all. Her mother had not died in childbirth or shortly after. Instead, she had not recognized her daughter as her own. For reasons I could not have explained at the time, this circumstance struck me as far more tragic than had both of Natalina's parents been killed in an industrial accident or a natural disaster. Another word, over the page, informed me why her mother had not wanted to be named on the birth certificate. Brefotrofio. I had to look it up. An Italian Wikipedia search enlightened. An institution distinguished from an orphanage that takes in and raises illegitimate, abandoned, and unrecognized infants at birth or in danger of abandonment. My translation. In short, a brefotrofio is a foundling home. The provincial official who recorded Natalina's birth ordered the baby be dispatched to the foundling home in Bologna and charged the midwife who oversaw her birth, Rosa Rizzi, with the task. It made sense now. The mother was unmarried. Her daughter was illegitimate. She had abandoned her. My impulse, when I understood the significance of those words, who does not consent to be named, was to assume some degree of maternal indifference, that the mother had cast off her daughter because she did not want her. Natalina, the unwanted Christmas gift. By withholding her name from her daughter's official papers, the woman consigned her to a life as a child of nobody. I experienced a kind of wild indignation on behalf of my great-grandmother. The missing corner of the birth document took on a new significance. Someone had clearly torn it off. Reading her birth record for the first time as an adult, Natalina needed it to marry my great-grandfather in 1923. She would have seen in stark black and white her mother's renunciation of her. I imagined that she must have ripped the thick paper in a rage of angry tears, reducing the small triangular segment to a pile of tiny pieces. I later learnt that the word she severed from the page was mamma, as in the house in Via Abate at number 2, by a mother who doesn't consent to be named, was born a baby of the female sex. The italics indicate the missing text. I was now convinced of it. I felt it too, that her mother had renounced all of us, the descendants who came after. It was a kind of inherited rage. She had denied Natalina a mother and us a deeper knowledge of ourselves.
Thank you. Why did you begin Mother Shadow with this chapter, and what's its significance?
I think I was always going to start the book from this point of discovery. I guess it sets up a few things. It sets up that search, the word that really lifted the lid on that family secret and provided the impetus to keep going. But it also was just as important was my emotional response to it, because this really sets up the emotional arc of the book, where I begin with this strong reaction that's kind of a little bit irrational, and the rest of the book becomes a discovery, this sort of dual discovery of, who this woman was and why she gave up her daughter, and why did I have this strong reaction, and what did it say about my feelings about mothering.
You conducted painstaking research. Please tell us about it and your most revealing discoveries, apart from the one we just talked about.
One of the first things I did was that Google search to understand what that word meant. I was living in Canberra at the time, and my Italian teacher had just moved back to Italy, to Turin, and her daughter had done some work for me before on my previous book. And I asked her whether she would be happy to help me on this new book. And just by complete luck, she was studying. I didn't even know that she was studying at the University of Bologna. So she said, sure, she would take on this task for me. And she, in Bologna, very quickly tracked down the foundling homes records, which were kept at the provincial archives in Bologna. She also did some library research for me at the Biblioteca Sala Borsa, the main library in Bologna. And so while she was kind of doing all that work, I was doing sort of the Google Scholar work of looking up, who had written, what academics studies had been done about this issue of foundlings in 19th century Italy. And it was a little bit of a precious metal type feeling in my Google Scholar research, where I discovered that there was this American researcher, David Kurtzer, who had actually done a lot of work just on Bologna's foundling home. There was also that work on foundling homes more in general, and it turned out that the 19th century had been, some called it the century of foundlings, because there were so many foundlings, children at that time. So there was a lot of research there for me to do to start pulling apart that original, very ignorant, closed-minded view I had that this mother must have given up a child because she didn't want her. Very quickly became apparent to me all the societal pressures, the pressures from the church on these poor women who were, just quite powerless to keep their children if they were unmarried. So I was doing that sort of broader research. And Milena, meanwhile, was coming back with these extraordinary findings from Bologna from specific archives. So we found that there's this kind of irony that foundlings, because they were the property of the state, their records were kept in a way that often in families, my family certainly, would just throw out personal records. There wouldn't be anything left for me to find. But because Natalina was a foundling, there was a treasure trove there. So the foundling homes kept a lot of details from the child's early years, including the wet nurses in the first year of her life, the foster family that she was then sent out to live with after she was weaned, the illnesses that she had as a child, which kind of told me that she was probably put to work really early and possibly mistreated as a child, the actual claim of mistreatment that she made against her foster parents when she was 14, and so precious, the letters that she wrote to the foundling home when she met my great-grandfather. She'd moved to Trieste by this stage and wanted the permission of the foundling home to get married, which she required, and also wanted to claim her dowry to which she was entitled as a foundling. So, that trove alone just told me so much about Natalina's life. And in the very beginning, I was really sort of focused on the life of a foundling child and how difficult and loveless it would have been. But gradually my attention shifted to the mother. And the most astounding finding that we made was we found the mother's name. And this, I was told by archivists and historians and anthropologists in Italy, was almost impossible to find the name of a mother who'd abandoned her child in the 19th century, because the laws at the time, and I think they continue to be, a mother who relinquishes a child, her name has to be kept secret for 100 years unless she gives permission otherwise. And at the time Natalina was born in the 1898, the foundling home didn't keep any records of the mother's name, making it virtually impossible to ever sort of put the pieces together like you can do today to link the child to the mother. Once I'd found the mother's name, that then opened this whole new avenue of research where I could go into the communal archives where the mother lived and I could find out details about her family and her upbringing.
How did that information change your view of her?
Oh, dramatically, because I very early after finding her name, I found that she was living with other family members at the time when she gave up the baby, that she'd actually had a son who she kept and she was living with a father. And so immediately from that point on, I started to worry about what the situation of this woman was, that she had these two children and she was living with her father and nobody else. But then we went to Bologna and I interviewed some more people, including the archivists of the parish where the mother lived and where the baby was born. I learned that she was very poor, that her father was a hemp worker and a bracciante, a day labourer. These were like the poorest of Italian workers at the time. They were not like the sharecroppers. They had no stability in either where they lived or their livelihoods. The men had to just turn up into the village square and see what bosses were there looking for work on a day-to-day basis. Like it was a really uncertain way to live and to bring up a family. So there were two things there, I guess, her poverty and then also this weird living situation. And it only got sadder and more concerning as my discoveries kind of went on.
It's extraordinary that you were able to find so much granular information.
It was. And, I found a lot more after that. So once I'd met those archivists, they wanted to sort of help me find out as much as I could. And we were living in Bologna then. I was continuing to do my research and they were continuing to look for information for me. And they came up with more. So I think I really discovered what the turning point in the mother's life, the mother's name was Ersilia. I discovered what the turning point in her life was, where I think everything almost became predestined at that point, that she was going to go on to live this life as this unmarried woman looking after her father with these fatherless children. So up until the age of 8, I think she'd probably had a fairly happy life full of stable family, even if the father's work wasn't stable. She lived with her paternal grandmother. She had both her parents, her mother and her father. She had an older sister. She had an older brother. She had a younger sister and then a baby brother. And when she was around the age of 8, there was just a terrible series of deaths in her family where essentially all the older women in her family died. So her grandmother died, her older sister died, and then her mother died in childbirth. The father sent the younger sister away, probably to work as a domestic in another family. And Ersilia was left as the oldest at 8, the oldest female in a household where she had to essentially serve her father and her older brother. And the baby brother died soon after he was born. The family moved from a village into a more remote cottage and then eventually into the town, probably so that Ersilia could get more stable work as a domestic servant, which she did become. And so that sort of told me that she didn't really have much say over where her life was going, and she was probably taken advantage of, exploited in some way. I don't know who the fathers of her children were. One can imagine that it was not a very happy situation for Ersilia.
An archivist in Bologna opened a cupboard that contained the type of gold nugget all biographers longed to find. What was it, and how did it affect your understanding of Natalia's mother?
Yes, so this was an extraordinary day for me. I was with Natalina, my researcher. We were visiting for the first time the provincial archives where Natalina's foundling records were kept. I had read in my Google Scholar research about these medallions that some of the mothers who relinquished their children would hide in the swaddling of the babies. And so when we'd finished looking at Natalina's documents, I asked the archivist if I could see these medallions. And the archive office was, pretty nondescript. Everything was white, laminated tables, white walls, but there was this old cupboard pushed up against the wall. And the archivist, when I asked if I could see these medallions, took out a big key and said, sure, and went over to this big old cupboard and opened it up for me. Now, this cupboard, the contents of it had been preserved from the day it left the foundling home. Inside was a wall of these half medallions. They were half because the mother would keep a half for herself and put a half with a baby so that if she ever came back to reclaim the child, the two halves could be matched. And they weren't just medallions, they were playing cards, ribbons, earrings, and a lot of these sort of religious tokens. And when I saw them there, they were all arranged on pins in the year in which the baby was given up. And there were literally would have been like 1,000 or more, spanning more than 100 years. I was just hit by this sort of wave of grief, it felt like. And in that moment, I felt the sadness and the loss, I think, of what those mothers must have felt as they were giving up their children. All of the tokens had the name of the child attached to them, and many of the pieces of paper had a cross, meaning those babies had died in the foundling home, because there were terrible losses of life in these foundling homes, which, never had enough milk to feed the babies, never had enough wet nurses. They were cold places, they were often unsanitary places, and lots of babies died. And all those tokens belonged to a baby that was never reunited with its mother. But the mother had placed that token there in the hope that one day she would be. And so it was really emotional for me to experience that. And it also altered my perspective, my sense of empathy and compassion for these women. And I already understood a lot more about the pressures on these women by this point, but it was the moment that really kind of changed how I felt about Ersilia and what must have led her to give up my great-grandmother.
It is just so devastatingly sad. Did you set out to blend biography, memoir and family history, or did the former merge organically as you drafted the narrative?
I think I really resisted putting myself into this book in the beginning. I'd already written another family memoir which, had a lot of my story in it as a journalist and the things that had happened to me as a journalist. And I really didn't want to put myself in this book. But I think that reaction, that response that I told you about, being so strong in the very beginning, kind of set me up to fail in my attempts to keep myself out of the book, because I had to understand that. And I think it did set up that second emotional arc, the one of the mother and what led her to give up that baby, but also there was my arc and me coming to understand why I responded in that way, and how that was connected to my own feelings as a mother with disability who desperately wanted a child but felt quite stricken by these feelings of not being able to mother my child in the way that I wanted to, because, I use a wheelchair. I lost my legs in a plane crash when I was a journalist. There were so many things as a mother, especially of a newborn, that I wasn't able to do, that I had to rely on other people to do for me. And I really had to understand those feelings of inadequacy. And I had to kind of realize that so many mothers across time, mothers even in my own family, have been constrained by circumstances beyond their control. And so I guess I found a real resonance with those two stories that helped me to become more compassionate towards not only other mothers, not only Ersilia, but also towards myself as a mother.
Every mother I talk to speaks about the feelings of inadequacy, whatever they are, and the sense that I know some who have very senior positions and who are highly capable who say that when they have their baby, they just feel totally inadequate. So it seems to be a common trait of all mothers.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
While memoir requires you to be both inside and outside your own experience simultaneously, biographical reimagining requires a different double consciousness. How did you navigate these differences to craft a cohesive narrative?
This book underwent many, many drafts. Thank goodness it did. In the beginning, it had a very different structure to the one that it has today. In the beginning, it was sort of boring, chronological, almost like a travel log, following our time in Europe, in Italy and beyond, trying to uncover these family details. It didn't really work. And it was with the guidance of a mentor who I found quite sort of late in the process, I began to reimagine the book in terms of themes, and the chapters became thematic and they combined something in the story of Ersilia and Natalina and then something in my own story. And I had to really search for what the connections were between the two stories and build them around this sort of particular theme. And so it was a process that wasn't always obvious from the beginning, but I had to be reminded of the reader's experience as well, and not just, what was easy for me to tell, and look for the resonances, the richness, and then also bring it back into the today, the historical, ground it in the today to kind of make it a bit more appealing to read. So that's how I got there in the end.
And it works really well. It really flowed well and was seamless.
Thank you.
In imaginatively reconstructing Natalia's story, you sometimes speculated, informing your imagination with archival records. What limits did you place on your imagination to prevent veering into fiction?
Sometimes you want to let your imagination go to create a bit more of a vivid, richer picture for the reader, informed by your research of what might have been going on. There was so much in Ercilia's story that I could never know, but there were some more likely scenarios that were more likely than others that quite possibly had happened to her. It was just always important to signal to readers when I was veering off into my imagination, but also to ground it in research and to kind of also signal that this wasn't just like crazy fantasy, that, there were good reasons for thinking that this might have been something that Ersilia experienced.
How did you signal to the readers?
Well, I guess by just including a lot of that research, but not in a boring way. That was always one of the challenges. There's obviously a lot more research that I did that doesn't appear in the book. And that's a good thing because you don't want to bore the reader. You don't want to, drown the writing in academic research, but you want to just be able to sort of select those really key, interesting details that bring the history to life. So you include those select details. And then when you go off into imagination, I might just use those exact words and just say, I'm picturing or I'm imagining. Yeah. And so you're just really clear at the start of the paragraph or whatever that's what you're doing.
One historian told me that we tend to use only about 10% of our research in our writing.
Yeah, it's good to remember that. The challenge is always in writing a book that is really research-based is to knowing when to stop researching and start writing.
Yes.
And I think I've learnt this over the course of writing 3 books, to get writing early, even if you haven't finished all your research. Like that is just as important in some ways as doing the research. Otherwise, you never get to the writing. And so,
Yes.
What is the point of doing it all? And then the other thing is just drafts, pulling out the unnecessary detail so that those magic details can kind of shine.
When reconstructing the life of a woman who did not consent to be named, What are your ethical obligations as a writer, and was there a line between reconstruction and projection?
Look, I was conscious all the time of the limits on what I could know and what I would never know. And if you're writing a book about a child, a foundling child of this time, you know that you are never going to know who the father was. Like it's just not going to be recorded anywhere, because the mothers were held accountable for the crime of having a child out of wedlock, and the fathers were just given total freedom to just carry on as always. Everything was against the woman in these circumstances. So there were things that I was just never going to know. And that was the biggest one. And when you are raising the possibility, as I did here, that there might have been family abuse, that is a really difficult thing to write about when you don't actually know. So I was conscious that I could be suggesting things that were untrue, that could upset other people in my family. It really upset me to have an anthropologist say to me that this could have been the case. And the reason why was because incest was so common in rural Italy at the time, and that these things were just never spoken about. So I was never going to find out if this had actually happened. And there was very little that was even written about it, because the church was so powerful and the church didn't want these things spoken about. And so it was always very difficult. Should I include this speculation? Should I leave it out? Was it dishonest not to include it? I think it would have been dishonest not to include the speculation when experts in the field had told me that this was a real possibility. And other experts said, look, it could just as easily have been a case that Ersilia, the mother, had to look after her father and so wasn't allowed to get married, and that this had happened to her in the course of her work as a domestic servant. It could have been a boss taking advantage of her. Like there was so many things it could have been. But one real possibility was family abuse. And so I felt like my obligation to be honest about something that to me was so confronting that I actually didn't want to write about it, and I wanted to kind of stop even researching it at the time. If I was going to write this book, I had to include it. And I did worry about how family members would respond. And I worried about how, for example, my mother would respond, and didn't even want to tell her about it. And it was she actually who suggested to me, when I told her all the circumstantial evidence that I'd uncovered without actually naming family abuse as being a possibility, she actually came up with it herself, because she said, well, it was just so common at the time. And when she did that, I realised that a part of my sort of horror was actually, my own issue, like that other people wouldn't necessarily respond, not even my own family would respond to it in the same way. That, I don't know, we all respond differently to things. And yeah, for me, I had to be truthful about the discoveries and the possibilities that I made, and that's what guided me ethically in the end.
In closing, what advice would you suggest to writers who blend biographical narratives with other genres such as memoir and family history?
I would say that, it's important to ask yourself why you're doing it in the very beginning, and to remain cognizant of why. I don't think I really understood in the beginning why I was doing this, but in being pushed sometimes by others, other readers of my early drafts, my motives became clearer. And I think that is a really important part of telling the story. Why is this of so much interest to you? What does it say about your own life that this particular story grabs you so obsessively from the beginning? And that becomes a part of the story too, understanding why it was so important for you to do this. Other things that I would say, I've mentioned obviously the importance of research, but getting writing early, the importance of writing drafts. I think the story really only becomes clear, certainly did to me, in the rewriting, and being obviously aware when you go into something like this that, there will be people who will be upset by what you're doing. That question of, who owns the stories, the historical stories in our family is a really fraught one, that we uncover stories that we weren't alive to experience ourselves, but in uncovering them, in learning about them, they kind of show us who we are and how we came to be and what shaped us. And then we can feel like they become our stories too. But not everyone in the family is going to agree with that. That's something that you have to navigate, and it can be really difficult and it can be distressing. So writing this family history and memoir, it can be really enlightening. It certainly helped me to process things and helped me to be more compassionate towards myself as a mother. So I think it was a really valuable book for me to write. But when we do write about true stories, you know, there are other people involved, and we just need to remember that it can be difficult sometimes.
Absolutely. Cynthia, thank you for chatting with us about Mother Shadow. At its heart lies one of the most intractable questions in biographical writing. How do we speak for and with justice to those who could not speak for themselves? You approach this question with both the discipline of an investigative journalist and the vulnerability of a memoirist. The result is a story that is simultaneously intimate and historical, personal and political, propulsive and meditative. Its hybrid form, memoir, detective story, lyric essay, family history, and biographical reimagining is a necessity because the story could not have been told any other way. Mother Shadow asks us to think about what biography can do when the archive is fragmentary and the subject has been made deliberately invisible. You make the very limits of the historical record part of the book's texture, weaving the gaps and silences into the narrative so that what is unknowable becomes paradoxically a form of presence. In doing so, you place yourself among the women biographers who've written against erasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriella. It was lovely to do this with you.
Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Special thanks to my producer, Andy Marr, web manager, Dylan Hamilton Foster, and Sunny Lauderdale for the music. We'd love you to take a moment to rate the show on the website, across social media, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your family and friends and on social media. To discover more about my guests and their biographies, head over to their show pages on biographersinconversation.com. There you'll find all our episodes and ways of getting in touch with us. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices every biographer faces. I hope you are too.